I am not a believer that in this country a right of citizenship is to bear a gun. Why? When you consider that the reason why it was the Maryland and the Virginia colonies that insisted, led by people like George Washington, says every man should have a gun. He meant every white man, because the black codes outlawed a black man from having a gun or to ride a horse. He couldn't ride a horse because then he could get away. He couldn't have a gun because then he could defend himself. And the worst thing, a white man's worst fear was to have to look down the barrel of a black man holding a gun. But that was our daily reality. So it was never intended for us, and nor was it intended for women. But George Washington said every man should have a gun. But Maryland and Virginia had the largest slave plantations and the largest slave population per capita in comparison to the white population. And the four factors that drove them insisting that if they were going to support the Bill of Rights, that the Second Amendment had to be in it, was number one, because they reasoned that with the gun they could form militias that would help them free themselves from the colonial control of England, the largest and the strongest army and navy in the world at the time, and that two, they could avoid the reconquest of the British. Number three, that with the gun they could dispossess the native peoples of their land from sea to shining sea, the Navajo, the Cherokee, the Apache, the Seminole, the Duwamish, the Puyallup, the Seneca, Indian, all the hundreds of tribes, that they could dispossess them of their lands because a bow and arrow was no match for a musket. Fourthly, that they then could import the Africans and subject them to a life of chattel slavery, because we would live our lives literally at the barrel of a gun. What did Weldon Johnson call it? Days when hope unborn had died. And fifthly, actually, there was a fifth reason, that in the westward movement going west, in the land grabbing, that they had to be prepared in the frontier. They had to be prepared to defend themselves against other settlers who were grabbing for the same land. And without sheriffs and without local police, you couldn't grab and hold any more land than you were able to defend. So from the standpoint of a white man in the 18th century, I understand why they believed that they had to have a gun to free themselves from their own colonizers, and to steal the land from the Native Americans, and to force slavery on other people, and to defend themselves against other white folks with guns. Now that all those factors are gone, the only thing left is this romanticized, fantastic notion about there is no real patriotism without a gun. And as a result, America uniquely has a problem with death at the hands of guns. 30,000 per year. Isn't it interesting that every other manifestation of threat to public health and safety was responded to by the passing of laws? When automobiles became a problem with death on the highways, seatbelt laws, increasing the requirements to even get a license. Manufacturers had to make cars differently. Some of us complained it seemed like cars are always totaled. That was by design, so that upon impact the car would absorb the energy and would fold like an accordion, so that the car absorbed the energy and not the passengers in the car. Because formerly they were built for the car to withstand the accident, but the people in it died because their bodies absorbed the energy. So they flipped it. The car will fold like an accordion. You will walk away and praise God that somebody had sense enough to change how cars were built to protect human lives. Anybody who's a caterer knows that the health inspectors require that you have to keep certain foods at a certain temperature of coldness. The water has to be at a certain temperature of hotness to kill bacteria, because if you don't, people's lives can be at risk and health can be at risk. Now we almost go through body cavity searches to get on a plane after 911. Every instance of threat to public health and well-being has been followed up by new laws and new regulations to protect Americans, and yet the leading cause of death in America, there is not a single response. That's BS. There is no reason why any civilian should be allowed to have military grade weapons. An AR-15 has a magazine clip of at least 33 rounds that it can fire off in 30 seconds if it's fully automated. It's intended for one thing, to kill as many people as quickly and as efficiently as you can. You can't use them for hunting. You don't need it to fend off a burglar. And why would a civilian in a non-military setting need military-grade weaponry? That is BS. And your hedonistic, narcissistic fantasies about why you need to have such weaponry should not trump my need to be safe from the neighbor next door who may not take their medication. As Obama said, we may not can stop killing, but we can stop mass killing. As Emma said, he couldn't have killed that many people with a knife, nor a six-shooter. And if the shooter in Las Vegas in October had a six-shooter, he couldn't have killed 58 people and left 812 dead. It was because as a civilian, he could get stockpiles of military-grade weapons with infinite rounds of ammunition under the auspices of the Second Amendment right. Most people defend the Second Amendment. If you ask them on the spot to quote it, they can't quote it. They're defending something that they don't know. They're defending a myth, a mindset. It's the shortest of all amendments. A well-regulated militia, comma, necessary for the preservation of a free state, period, the right, or semicolon, the right of the citizenry to keep and bear arms shall not be abridged. The second word in is regulated. And yet the current rhetoric is that if we take bump stops, if we have universal background checks, if we make limitations based upon mental health, what will they take next? We're on the slippery slope. When even as it reads, it says not only regulated, but well-regulated militias. Ain't nobody in here in a militia, because the sun has set on the British Empire. We are no longer held in bondage other than prisons. And Geronimo, Cochise, and Sitting Bull, you put them on reservations long time ago. The only thing left is this obsessive, compulsive, ridiculous notion that there's no such thing as American citizenship without a gun. That is BS. And if you don't want to listen to me, listen to your children. The children whose bodies were ripped in half by the AR-15 at Newtown at 5 and 6 years of age. Almost all of them had to have closed casket funerals. They weren't old enough to raise their voices, and now there's an army of digitally armed soldiers whose childhoods are being stolen, who cannot function, who cannot focus on their trigonometry and their history and their civics lessons because they're wondering who's coming through the door.